Hello, in this video we're going to be looking at Chapter 16 in our textbook, and you can see that the topics for the chapter are working with user interface controls and adding multimedia to our applications. This should go fairly quick. I think that most of you should be familiar with a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about. And these objects that we're going to be calling controls are also called controls in other languages. So if you worked with Visual Studio, creating applications, that's one of the first things you learned how to do is to work with controls. Everything from buttons to text fields to labels, etc. And a lot of the stuff we're doing here is the same. It's just that we're doing it with Java and JavaFX. Some of the terminology is a little bit different, but the concepts really are essentially the same. Alright, so they have a little bit of a breakdown here in terms of where all these controls fit in terms of the hierarchy of the objects within the application. And remember, here they're starting with node is kind of like the root, and node, remember, is something that sits inside of either a scene and or a pane. Really, a scene and a node are kind of on the same hierarchy level. And then those sit on the stage. And then a node can be comprised of various different kinds of panes and other objects that sit within them. And really, that whole category of controls really encompasses all the stuff that you see here. I think there might actually be a few others that we're not seeing, but I could be wrong about that. All right. Now, when you guys were creating applications in Visual Studio, depending on who your instructor was, did they ask you to put little prefixes in front of naming things? So for example, if I created a button in the name field, they would make you do like BTN calculate or something like that. Did you guys do that?
I don't think it was required, but I got in that habit anyway.
Yeah. And they're suggesting here basically the same thing, that they have prefixes that they use as a standard in this language, some of which are similar and some of which are not. So with Visual Studio, we'd use like a 3-letter prefix, and you can see label is the same as it would be. But button is just BT, CHK, that's similar. Radio button, that's different. Text field, what's a PF? Password field, okay. Yeah, a text area. That's combo box. Yeah, I was just going to say. List view, scroll box. Scroll bar. Okay. Slider. What's this one? MP. Next page.
Media player.
Oh yes, the media player. Okay. I never knew they used the prefix for it, but yes. So it's right there. All right, so when you're putting things in, so that's going to tell you that really the media players are actually controls. And whether you know it or not, you never probably got that far with Visual Studio, but they're controls inside that environment as well. So it's a pre-configured object that we just pull in, and then we can just drop stuff into it. So that's pretty powerful just on that standpoint. All right, you guys know what a label is in an application? And then I'm trying to look for an example of an application here, right? So we might have an object on the screen, and a label is just simply a snippet of text that we usually use to describe one of the other controls or something on the screen. And it's usually a short snippet of text, and its function predominantly is just to sit there. It is possible to change the contents of it and manipulate anything within any one of these controls programmatically. So any of the properties that they have, if they have some sort of a property, we can apply some code to do something with those properties. All right. Another main control is button, obviously. And we've already played with those a little bit. And they give some examples here, and I would encourage you to try them.
Is this just intending to be like a review real quick?
Yeah, basically we're going off through all the different controls, and my goal here is not to kind of burden you with every single example, because I know you guys can read this and some of it is repeat conceptually, is to actually build the applications that are the homework, and then we'll see how they work and get a feel for it. All right. We know what a checkbox is, right? How does a checkbox differ from a radio button?
A radio button usually goes with a group where you can only pick one option.
Yeah, that's one of the significant differences. Well, first of all, one is squarish and one is round. That's the difference. But you're right, a radio button has this quality to it that if you have multiple radio buttons within an area of an application, and this is true on web pages too, that you can only select one of the boxes at any given time, where a checkbox can have multiple boxes selected. So that's a distinction. Now, I guess I am kind of maybe glossing over some of this a little too quickly, because some of them do have different attributes and methods that go with. And a couple of them just caught my eye that I thought were important. All right, so for a checkbox, I think is where it starts to get a little bit interesting, and that is where we're starting to look at how we check to see if it is selected. And that's not too much different. Like if you were learning Visual Basic, I think you say is checked, I think is the approach. So not too far off syntactically. And then notice that the example applications show that if you click your box that you can actually change what you're seeing up on the screen. And that would be in this little demo that's coming up here. Notice also that they're invoking a superclass here as they're working. All right. All right, so radio button, you guys know what that looks like. All of them fire action events at this point. I think nothing too unusual here. We also have our text fields. Remember that different prefix there. Text areas, that's very much like HTML. The text areas do have some extra things in there, and I know that if you worked with HTML forms, you probably are familiar with the fact that you usually have a column count and a row count, and this is very much the same way. And how is it counting? Well, it's counting based upon the number of monospaced characters that would normally fit within that container. Now, it does make note here that if you're using text area, it's often useful to create a scroll pane, which obviously does what it implies, and that is create the little scroll bars to allow stuff to fit one direction or the other. Now, notice that they also have this thing called a description pane, and that's extends border pane. And then they're also doing the same thing with a text area. So they're kind of building upon that structure and extending it is really all they're doing. All right. The other control here is a combo box. This is called different things in different languages too. But it's basically where you have a drop down and you can select different choices. Depending on which choice you pick, it will trigger different events. That also will be using that whole action event thing. and then you can actually set up various things to happen given your choice. So let me see if they have an example of that here. And you can see that the different choices that you'll make in your combo box will be triggered by an array, basically. So you'll put all your values into an array, and then as you make your various selections from the combo box, it pulls in that value and then does whatever the program needs it to do. But that's how it pulls things in. And if you use that as a comparison as to how we do select boxes in HTML, which is a good comparison, there you don't actually create an array to pull the values in, where here you do. And there's some advantages to doing it that way, and I've seen a lot of people that do JavaScript versions of the same thing because it actually works pretty well. And that way you have all that stuff kind of put into one spot.
Okay, so the combo box is file description or flag description?
We were just looking at what the structure of the program was here, and
my main question is, it just says set display 0. How does it know what to set? What if you have multiple combo boxes?
There's an array in there.
well, if you have multiple combo boxes, then you make accommodations for that. I mean, that sounds silly, but what this is saying is set display to 0. That just means whichever one is the default.
Okay.
So that's the one that shows by default when you have a combo box. And some people work around that sometimes by creating like an initial position that's got nothing in it, like a blank string or something, and that choice doesn't do anything. But if you know for a fact that it's going to do a particular thing, then you set it up in advance to do the default. Does that help to clarify that?
Kind of. I just mean, usually you would call it flag description dot set display or something. I don't know.
No, the flag description, all that's doing is holding the value that would display. That's what it's pulling in, basically. I'm not sure how else to say.
The flag description holding the string.
Yeah. So it's holding it. Let's look at like the output of it. Do they have an output of this one? Picture of it somewhere? Yeah, right here. So that's the contents that are going to go in. The top part of that code let's see, we're not getting the whole observable list here. All right, so see right here how we're actually setting it up. So like, where is it pulling those names in from? Is that really your question?
Yeah, I guess.
Okay. What it's doing is, if you look at the solved version of this, so it's putting up the flag. We've got a text area where it's putting the text, but here's the actual combo box.
Right.
And if I'm reading your or hearing your question correctly, when you click this down, where are we getting this from?
I guess I want to know what set display 0 has anything to do with anything. If it's not, there are no items in the combo box yet. There could be multiple combo boxes. It just doesn't. What is it doing?
0 doesn't mean the first item in the string or the array.
Yeah, it grabs the first position in the array is what it does. Yeah.
Right, but how does it know it's referring to that array? Everything else has to be like array dot set display.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So how do you differentiate which one it's actually pointing to?
And also, why is it called before it's even anything in the box?
Well, this is a method, right? So where does that method exist?
It's got to be a global method or something. Oh, they wrote it.
Yeah, it's a written method. So look at what it does is it pulls in the index value. So if you throw in the index value of 0, it's going to look at.
Got description pane dot set title. That's exactly what I was.
Okay.
So
I'm sorry it was such a watered down really explanation, but it's just pulling in the first thing from the list, and in this case, it's going to be Canada and the Canadian flag. So that, in combination with the way that they're pulling in the names of the flags, because if you look at the images, the names on the flags are the names. So this is Canada.gif or whatever. All right, let's move forward. Another one here is list view, and list view, it looks something like this. So I think of list view as like kind of a good place to take things that are, you know, listable per se. So in other words, that they have like particular individualized values that can go into a box. I'm trying to think of like a Visual Studio equivalent, and maybe that would be a list box, but that's not quite the same. Because if you remember how that works, you add one entry at a time, line by line. That's probably the biggest correlation with it. The look can be different, but notice that you are able to do selections in this structure. So I can click on one and select it, or I could control click or shift arrow down, you know, to select multiple items. And depending on how you select, you can actually switch selection modes, so you can use that programmatically as well. So anything that we can do that way, we can invoke some sort of an action to have it do something beyond what we're looking for. So in this little demo that they've put together, the capability is I click on China, probably hold down Control, click Germany, both of their flags pop up, which is kind of neat. Now the one thing actually that this just happens to be on the screen, but typically when we've been writing code and you learn how to program, we learn just from the code first, right? We don't think too much about what the output's going to look like. It's like we get the stuff to work, and then we clean it up. But when you're working graphically, it's not that the code's not important, but a lot of times you start with how it looks first, and then you put the stuff in. But of course, how it looks depends on what it is you want to do. So that's why they have it listed in this fashion. So that's something we want to always keep in mind when we're doing this stuff. All right, more controls. We got the scroll bar, and this can be very helpful in a lot of different ways. Now, one way, you know, we think of a scroll bar as, you know, something like this. We can slide up and down, but that's not necessarily the only direction it would work in, or for the necessarily even that particular scenario. But we can do horizontal ones as well. And then they also have these values that we can throw in to help us figure out what the limits are. You know, where are we coming from and going to in terms of how far it goes. All right. So that can be a little bit you know, automatic or overwhelming depending on how you look for it. But a lot of it will actually be based upon, you know, if you're thinking about like this type of scroll bar, where it's based upon the size of the window itself. So a lot of it is set dynamically. We don't say that it's 300 pixels. We just say get the width, and then we'll go from there. And if you think about how a lot of these are structured in applications these days, where the width of the actual handle is also proportional to how big the document is that you're scrolling through. And I remember when that was first brought about, how useful that was, or at least I thought so. All right. So they do have both horizontal and vertical values that you can put in. And then they also have this thing for block increment. And what that stands for is during the scroll, like, see right now, like I'm scrolling with my mouse, but it like jumps. And that is the block increment. What's that set for? Some of that's controllable directly through the mouse software, but some of it is actually encoded into the software itself. So that's something to note. All right. Another one that we have now is a thing called slider, and sliders can be very useful for doing a lot of what they're implying here, and that is to, you're not scrolling through text, but what you're doing is you're choosing values over a range, and instead of putting in a specific value, you can just kind of move it to where it needs to go, or you can have it move to where your program tells it to go. So it can be one or the other. Now this is one of those things they've also added to HTML5 form elements, which can be pretty useful there as well. All right, and they have a demo for that. All right, and here they have a little bouncing ball slider where you can change the speed of the bounce, and they give you the code for that. And then here towards the end of this stuff, they're showing you how to do a tic-tac-toe game. And I think this is one that we might want to bring up on video. So if those of you at home see the little video note here, you can go to the author's site and pull it down. I think that one's actually kind of fun to investigate. Now, the last section here that I want us to go into, and I should probably make you guys do that tic-tac-toe game, right? It teaches you about arrays at the very least. And this is the part where a lot of people have been waiting for, I think, and that is the ability to actually put video and audio onto your applications, because that's pretty powerful, and you know, we kind of take that for granted. Very much the same way that we might place something onto a web page these days, in the modern approaches. JavaFX applications have certain components built in that we can call upon to create the spot for where it's going to go. So it has basically a built-in player. Notice some of the tags here: media, media player, media view, and then as we're working with media components, well, most of them have a duration because they run for a certain amount of time. We also set the size. I mean, that's pretty obvious. You do that with HTML too. And then it's got some built-in things like this where you can autoplay. Sounds like HTML, right? You can keep a count, cycle count. You can mute, control the volume, the length. You can invoke pause and play methods, which are pretty useful. And I think most of those are intuitive. If not, you might want to read this in a little bit more detail. Should have learned some of this earlier in your program. If not, just take your time and read through. Now, here they have a little bit of an example of the application that they're putting together. And in order now to be able to play this video, we're not pulling in a video from YouTube, so that you don't go to YouTube and get the embed link. You actually need to have a video file available to make this happen. And let's just look at the key parts here. One of the key parts is right inside the start method that we actually invoke a new instance of media. Then we also have a new instance of media player and media view. So there's actually 3 different components that are being thrown in there: media, the player, and the view. There's also a button set up, and you can see it's set up to handle an event. And so basically, if you click on, you know, the button that looks like a play button or the button that looks like a pause button, it will do exactly what you say. So and really the controls there are, you just say media player dot play and dot pause, and that's all it really takes for that part. They also have a little thing put in here where they're programming something for the rewind button. So if you click the double arrow backwards, it sets the duration back to 0, so back to the starting point. And then they go through and they take some of the other elements that you should already know. Like, for example, they're using a slider, and that's going to be set for changing the volume. So it's not something that's built into the media player, notice. It's something that we're adding manually. So once again, it's not like the player that's built into HTML5. It does still require this manual control. And that's really about it. I mean, that's about all it takes. And then you need to have, suppose you have to have the file that you're going to play, and that's, notice, listed here outside of the start method. And he is giving us a URL. So if you wanted to use the video that he's showing, you can actually connect to an external source for it. So you notice it is providing a full URL web address, just like we would in an HTML program or page. The other thing you can do is if you're going to have any sort of media like this is to embed it locally. So one option would actually be is that you go to this URL and download it. That would be one option. If you guys have your own videos you want to try to use, that's fine too, like maybe something you took on your phone. So that's a possibility. Do notice the file formats though, and I really don't want to make this a talk about video file formats, but MP4 is one of the better ones to use generally for delivering electronic content that works on many different devices. What's a good choice for audio, you guys? Yeah, MP3 is the good audio choice, and MP4 is a good video choice. There are other formats that they've been pushing a lot, but from my experience, that's the one that works most universally on most devices: Apple, Mac, Android, Linux. It's a good file format, very flexible. All right, so they once again show this hierarchy here. So you have the media player, and then the media view. And the media view is actually the component that will end up showing the actual content within it. Kind of the same way we looked at earlier where it was image and image view. Remember the distinction between the two? Sort of, at least. All right. Proof is in the pudding, I suppose. All right, and that is kind of the crux of the chapter that way. Now, the thing that's interesting about the media is I had it, well, I shouldn't say I had it. The author has it so that it was pulling up a video, right? But there's no reason why it has to be a video. It could be audio as well. Now, I don't know if they go into a large amount of detail on what formats you should use, but I think the ones that I indicated to you are probably your safe bets. And then notice that he's got a little technique he's using here where he is pulling in the files from an external source, but he actually sets up a variable to hold the base URL. So any other files he's going to be looking for are in this folder, but he wants the names to be automatically generated because apparently he has more than a few. So he's using some of the techniques that we saw earlier where you put in some of the stuff and then use this to fill in part of it, and then you get the file extension. All right. As I was just telling him, he gets a little complicated with this example, but it does show you how you can actually play audio instead of video in this circumstance, so that's pretty helpful. And that's basically the chapter. So I didn't spend a lot of time belaboring this chapter because I know that you guys know most of these concepts, and it's really just a matter of working with the syntax. So that's actually going to end our Chapter 6 lecture, and then we're going to pick up by creating videos on working through the exercises. All right, this video ends here.